Get business done with the new American Express Graphite Business Cash Unlimited card. With unlimited 2% cash back on all eligible purchases, unlimited 5% cash back on flights and prepaid hotels booked through American Express Travel Online, and a flexible spending capacity that can grow with your business, you'll have the confidence to keep building. Apply today and earn a welcome offer of $1,500 cash back after you spend $50,000 in qualifying purchases on your new card within the first 6 months of card membership. Terms apply. Learn more at go.amex/graphite.
Mornings have a rhythm. You can hear it, feel it. And at Quaker, we fuel it. With 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber in every bowl, helping you turn that rhythm into your soundtrack for a great day. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
I-O, let's go! I-O, let's go!
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and back once again with me. This is the first time I have two guests on the same episode. I have the brilliant Jon Parshall and the equally brilliant Trent Hone. Hello, gentlemen. For those of you who don't know, I've had both guests on before. I'll start with Jon. Jon currently can be seen in the World War II documentary with Tom Hanks on the History Channel. Yep. Highly recommend that. Then he also has a new book, which he's going to kindly hold up for us. 1942. Yeah, look at that. I mean, how many pages is that, Crux of War?
1,280. Yeah, boy.
And I guarantee he had to edit some of that, right?
Oh, yeah, a little bit. I was very lucky. I mean, Oxford was they were just like, you go do you. So, yeah, it's a big book. It can be part of your personal fitness program. But, yeah, it is out now. So
you can kill a grizzly bear with that. What is Crux of War about, Jon?
It's basically how the Allies turned around their train wrecks that year and lay down the foundation for ultimate victory in the war. I think 1942 is the most important year in the war, and that's the argument that I'm setting out in this book.
All right.
No, it's about everything. It's the whole world.
Yeah, all fronts, not just Pacific. It's, Eastern Front, Mediterranean, strategic bombing, the Manhattan Project, the whole schmear.
And Trent as well has a book out. It's called Mastering the Art of Command, which is available now on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. And then you have a new book coming out on Admiral King in a few months, right, Trent?
Yes, that should be out in the spring, also through Naval Institute Press.
Okay. Title TBD.
Title TBD. It's with their marketing department. I'm sure they'll come up with something snappy.
Is it a biography or just during his World War II service?
No, it's not just World War II service. It is command opportunities that he had throughout his career. So not exactly a biography because it doesn't get into his personal life or those details, but it's a good view of his career and how he developed the skills to become an effective leader and strategist and how he exploited those skills in World War II. Okay.
Very good. We'll look for that as well in a few months. But yeah, today's topic, we're going to discuss the Battle of Midway in two parts. This is part one. For those of you who don't know, the Battle of Midway was fought from June 4th through the 7th, 1942, and became one of the most decisive naval battles of the war. Without going too much into the backstory, that is Pearl Harbor and Philippines, how did we get to this point in the war? And we'll start with Jon.
Well, let's talk about Pearl Harbor and the Philippines because that's important to get here. Basically, yeah, the war up until June of 42 has been a dumpster fire for the Allies. Pearl Harbor sinks half of our battle fleet, and the Japanese unleash this enormous southward-oriented offensive that ends up gobbling up the Philippines, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Malaysia, Burma. All of that is under the Japanese boot by the end of about May of 1942. So the U.S. has been on the defensive that entire time. And now, fast forward, we get some intel through our code breakers that the Japanese are going to try to capture this little island called Midway, which is about 1,100 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii. And that kind of sets the stage for this battle. I would also say that I have real problems with using the word decisive in conjunction with Midway, and Trent is smiling knowingly here because we've had beers over this topic before. I don't look at Midway as being decisive in the classical sense. I look at a battle like Hastings, that was decisive. You win the battle, you win the war. Tsushima, kind of the same deal between the Japanese and the Russians in 1904. But Midway, I don't think is that same kind of deal just because World War II is not that kind of a war.
So it's not a Waterloo event.
Yeah, it's not. Trent, you want to pile in on that? How do you feel?
Absolutely. I agree with you. I don't think it is decisive. One of the things that I try to stress, because it is often referred to as decisive, it is often referred to as transferring the initiative from the Japanese to the Allies or the Americans. And I don't think it does either one of those things. I think if the initiative is now in the balance, right? The Japanese no longer really have it. The Allies don't really have it either. But it takes the offensive at Guadalcanal to really transfer the offensive to the United States and the Allies. So Midway is really important because of the opportunities it creates, but not because it is in and of itself decisive. So that's what I would say.
You guys and I were talking before the call. We'll start with Trent this time. How important is military intelligence in this particular battle? It seems like maybe it's overblown, maybe it's underblown, but it seems like it's critical in the outcome.
It's absolutely critical. It doesn't happen without intelligence, or at least not the way that it actually unfolds. And John, a moment ago, made it sound like, I mean, it's all correct, right? But we get some intelligence. The Japanese are going to attack this island called Midway. But the intelligence picture had started to clarify, at least among the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, long before that. They start getting a sense that they can read some of the Japanese operational messages early in 1942. One of the things that the carrier raids that Admiral Nimitz conducts with his forces that starts to trigger is additional Japanese traffic. So there's more messages that can then be attacked through these code-breaking activities. And the real initial unlocking of that is when Nimitz gets a window into the Japanese plans for the Battle of the Coral Sea, the amphibious operation that would take Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea. And Nimitz uses that as a tool, like, look, they're going to try this. The enemy's going to try this amphibious operation. I can ambush them. I can bring all my carriers together because I've got insights into their order of battle. I've got insights into their timing. Let's position forces so that, we can win something significant. It doesn't turn out that way. Nimitz only gets 2 carriers in the Coral Sea in time, but that helps him gain confidence into the signals intelligence, the code breaking that's emerging. And one of the things that I think is really important is Nimitz knew that from prior experience. He'd been the commanding officer of cruiser Augusta, which was the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. And in 1934, the Asiatic Fleet was listening in to Japanese operational maneuvers and breaking the less sophisticated codes that they had at that time. So Nimitz knows what code breaking can do almost a decade prior to Midway.
Here's my pushback to all that, though. I mean, when the first books on code breaking started coming out in the late 1980s, like Layton's I Was There and all that stuff, we have this popular image in our heads that, if we're reading the other guy's mail, we win, right? We show up at the right time and it's game over. That is not true. It's one thing to have operational level intelligence saying, the Japanese are bringing their carrier force here. You still have to have tactical forces that are good enough to win the battle. And to draw an analog to another series of battles that's going on around this same time, the British in the Northern Desert had really good intel on what Rommel was going to do to them via, Enigma and all that kind of stuff. It didn't do them a damn bit of good because at the point of the spear, their forces tactically just weren't good enough at combined arms to beat Rommel. So we have to prove in June at Midway that, okay, this is all great and we're reading the other guy's mail, but we got to get our bombs on the target. So that's the issue there.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out, especially with Enigma. Like, we're breaking the codes and we're getting all this intelligence, but it even shows it in the Imitation Game movie. Like, which parts do we act on? We can't act on all of them. So we have to pick and choose which ones we're going to focus on.
Yeah, for sure. And even though we have broken Japan's codes, we're still only reading about 10% of the code groups there too. So you have to do a lot of, hoodoo voodoo kind of stuff with traffic analysis and what code groups you have broken. It's not like we had a perfect picture of what the Japanese were bringing to the party for this operation. Even up until, like June the 2nd or so, we don't have a good picture of how many carriers the Japanese are going to be bringing to this operation. So, yeah, it's not a perfect crystal ball.
Well, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to eliminate the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers by luring them into a trap near Midway Atoll. What is the history of Midway, Trent, and why is this a good trap location?
Well, it is sort of the last major atoll or island that is part of the Hawaiian chain. And so you could see it as a potential stepping stone to an assault on Hawaii, or a location from which Hawaii could be interdicted, even if the Japanese lack the resources or the wherewithal to assault Oahu itself, which, is likely to be the case. I forget exactly how many defenders are on Oahu at this time, but I think it's 2 U.S. Army divisions. It's something like 70,000 soldiers. So, actually invading Hawaii and taking it over is very unlikely, even if the Japanese managed to occupy Midway. But it is a position that is going to threaten the ability of the United States to project power to the West. And so therefore it's seen as in the planners among the Japanese side, Admiral Yamamoto Irisoku and his staff, that this is a location that the U.S. Navy will have to fight for. Like if we go out there and we seize it, or if we threaten it, then the U.S. Navy will come out. So it's seen as a lodestone, an anchor that's going to draw those carrier forces, the remaining battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and allow them to be destroyed in a large battle. That's the clue. But part of the challenge here is, right, the Yamamoto's, how do I get the U.S. Navy to fight? They're running around, they're making these, I'm going to call them pinprick attacks. In many cases, they're more substantial than that, but they're like these annoyances. They're out there. I can't pin them down. How do I do that? How do I trap them so I can destroy them with my superior force? And so that's the struggle he's wrestling with.
Yeah, John, it seems to me like the Japanese want like this one big decisive victory, where the Allies see it more of we're going to have a long, drawn out war. This is just one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Japanese naval doctrine was all built around this notion of what they called Kantai Kessen, which is one big climactic battle that's going to break the U.S. Navy, and that's going to force the Americans to the bargaining table. And it's nonsense from the standpoint of the U.S. I mean, you're not going to break our morale over just one battle. And again, that points to the difference of what this kind of war is. World War II is this big multinational contest between alliance blocks, and 1942 era America is a completely different animal than 1904 Tsarist Russia was. We have enormous recuperative capacities, and even if we were to lose this battle at Midway, it's not necessarily going to drive us from the war. And we've got this enormous shipbuilding program that's going on, and by 1944, we're going to replace all those losses easily.
The other thing that strikes me is the element of surprise that the Japanese wanted here. You can have all the radio silence you want, but I think the surprise thing went out the door with Pearl Harbor. We're kind of ready for them now, no matter, maybe the Aleutian Islands was a little bit of a surprise, but I don't think there's going to be any surprise in Hawaii if the Japanese show up again.
Yeah, no, that's true. I would say, too, that one of our big advantages in this battle is that we have a lot of PBY scout planes up in Midway. That's one of our decisive sort of trump cards in this battle, is way more scouting assets. And that allows us to get the drop on them when they come in. Trent?
Yeah, I do think that the Japanese are hoping for a certain element of operational surprise, all right, because the action so far has primarily been in the South Pacific. Right, they are threatening to cut Australia off, or at least the lines of communication between the West Coast and Australia off. The U.S. carriers have been sighted in the South Pacific. That is, in the Japanese mind, where the center of gravity currently is, or the center of focus of the U.S. Navy. And so they think they have a window within which they can move into Midway, strike Midway, and then position their reconnaissance forces, primarily submarines, in such a way that they'll have advance warning if the U.S. Pacific Fleet attempts to contest their operation. It doesn't work out that way at all. This is where the intelligence is valuable, right? Because it gives Admiral Nimitz a clear sense of, oh, the Japanese are going to attack Midway. I need to position my forces to attack Midway. He uses operational deception to make them think that the carriers are still in the South Pacific, withdraws them as rapidly as possible, and positions them for an ambush before their submarines are in place. So there's code breaking, reconnaissance, successes and failures, and deception going on at multiple levels to set all this up.
That leads me to my next question. American codebreakers successfully decipher key portions of the Japanese naval communications, including the term AF that kept coming up. Was this a tip-off for U.S. intelligence, and how critical was this in the battle? Is it overly important or underly important?
Really, what's going on there is you've got a bureaucratic fight going on between the intel people in Hawaii and the intel people in Washington, D.C. And so the folks in Hawaii are like, we know that AF is Midway. We've known that for months, but we can't convince our bosses over in D.C. that, by the way, we know what it is that we're doing here. And so this famous transmission in the clear from Midway, we send a message up to them via an undersea cable that can't be tapped into, or like broadcast that your plant is broken. And so, they do that, the Japanese pick it up, and that's how, we confirm that AF is Midway. But really all that does is it allows the people at Hypo, which is in Hawaii, to be able to, wave some papers at the folks in DC and say, yo, dog, we know what we're talking about. AF is Midway. So that kind of settles that fight. That's how I look at it. Trent?
No, I agree completely. That is, from my reading of the archival sources, exactly what's going on. Because Hypo already knows AF is Midway. And Nimitz has already positioned his forces, or is in the process of positioning his forces, as in anticipation of the Japanese coming to Midway. Washington, they're not convinced yet. The codebreakers, but also Nimitz's boss, Admiral King, not sure. Probably a good idea to leave some carriers in the South Pacific. They do this ruse, and as John so aptly demonstrated, then they can wave their paper. See, we're right. That's where they're going.
Yeah. Well, I guess if you're planning an operation of this scale, you want absolute certainty on where they're going.
Except you're never going to get that. This is a war. Only breaking 10% of the code group, so we're never going to have that. We're just taking our best guess based on the estimates.
And the Pacific is a huge. And we'll get into it when they're doing scouting with the planes. Like, you have to cover so much ground looking for the enemy.
Yes.
So I can see why they want to be very precise with this.
Yeah, they do, for sure.
Okay, let's get into the numbers a little bit. The U.S. Navy commanders, led by Admiral Nimitz, concentrated their limited carrier forces northeast of Midway before the Japanese arrived. So let's start with Trent this time. How large were the forces on each side?
Well, if we're counting carriers, then there's 3 on the U.S. side, but I think it's also important to count Midway. At this point, Midway has over 100 planes on it. John mentioned the PBYs. Those are the Scout seaplanes, but it's also got a battery of other aircraft, Army, Air Force, Marine, Navy, all ready to either search for or strike the Japanese when they're seen. Nimitz has also positioned a submarine cordon to the northwest of Midway Atoll in anticipation that the Japanese will approach from that direction, and in the hope that the submarines will, be able to attrit the Japanese forces as well. The Japanese are coming, of course, with their carrier force, the Kido Butai, or the bulk of it. It's got 4 aircraft carriers in it at this point. There was some fear on the U.S. side, or I don't know if fear is quite right, but apprehension that maybe the Japanese would have a 5th carrier. They only have 4. John could get into the details of why it's not 5, but they also have an invasion force, and they're backing that up with a very powerful surface group that is going to be the force in the plan that wins the decisive battle once the remainder of the U.S. Pacific Fleet shows up and tries to liberate or thwart the occupation of Midway. So you've got a lot of forces on the Japanese side, just in terms of fighting strength. It outweighs what the U.S. can bring to bear, But if we're talking about what's really going to matter, it's aircraft and those aircraft carriers. And there, the odds are much closer to even, if not a little tilted on the U.S. side.
John, what is point luck and the positioning of carriers to mitigate risk?
I was just going to pipe in just some more numbers for you. Japanese are bringing 248 carrier aircraft. The Americans, I think, have 236 on their carriers. And then, as Trent mentioned, another 100 or so. And if you look at the actual warships that are coming, the Japanese are bringing 21 and the Americans are bringing 24. So, again, pretty evenly matched at the tip of the spear. So there's this famous point called Point Luck. And Point Luck is to the northeast of Midway Island. It's about it's 180 some miles northwest of the island. This is where the American carriers are going to congregate. And the way Nimitz initially sets this battle up, Point Luck is hella far away from where the Japanese are anticipated to show up, such that this means that our carriers are going to be outside Japanese scouting range. And the battle plan is that basically Nimitz is going to use his land-based air power and his submarines to try to whittle the Japanese carrier force down to size before he makes the decision to commit his aircraft carriers. So that means that because Point Luck is so far away, really the initial battle plan is for a 2-day battle, that the American carriers wouldn't show up until there's been sort of a go, no-go decision made to bring them in, and they probably couldn't have gotten there until day 2. But what ends up happening on June the 2nd, Hypo determines definitively that the carrier Zuikaku is not coming to the party. And Yorktown has been patched up and brought up to the area around Midway. And so on the morning of June 2nd, now Nimitz has got all 3 of his carriers up there, and battle hasn't been joined yet. So he then sends a message to Fletcher, Frank Jack Fletcher, who's the tactical commander in charge up there, and he suggests that it would be prudent for him to move his carrier forces further to the west. And so Fletcher does that night, moves them about 180 miles closer to where we think the Japanese are going to show up. And what that means, Nimitz is comfortable enough now, knowing that the Japanese are only bringing 4 carriers. I've got 3 on station. I'm going to dial up the risk-o-meter a little bit. I'm going to put my forces closer together so that's what creates the battle that we actually see happening, where our carriers can attack on day 1.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys, the Japan Strike Force is commanded by Admiral Nagumo, included the 4 fleet carriers we were talking about that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. So is there a revenge factor here? Because the Americans probably knew that 4 fleet carriers from the Pearl Harbor attack were going to be there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I just have to comment, though, on John's note about, Nimitz suggesting to Fletcher. Yeah. I mean, if anybody's ever gotten a suggestion from a 4-star, then they understand what that really means. It's not like, hey, I think you ought to consider this. It's get your butt in gear because this is how we're going to fight the battle now, which is what Fletcher does, because he understands the context, and he understands that. I would put it less in terms of revenge factor. I do think that is an important consideration, certainly for some of the participants of this battle, but it's more like this is the Japanese First Air Fleet has just run roughshod over the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean. It is a force the likes of which the world had never seen before. All right, it combines firepower and mobility in ways that no other nation can do. And so one of the things that is, I think, foremost in Nimitz's mind is until I deal with that, I can't do much of anything. So he's thinking about revenge, but he's also thinking about the fact that he's got Admiral King, he's got Navy Secretary Frank Knox, he's got the President Franklin Roosevelt. All of these gentlemen are breathing down his neck, basically saying, we have to do something in the Pacific. We have to stem this tide of defeats. We have to win a victory. And, he's doing the logical calculus, Nimitz is, until I do something with those Japanese carriers, I cannot proceed. I cannot prosecute this war the way that I'd like to be able to. So, here's the opportunity. Let's go for it. Let's create the conditions so that, yes, it's risky, but tilt the playing field sufficiently in the U.S. favor.
If there was Kalshi or poly market prediction markets at the time, Would this have been like a 40% chance of success for the Americans, or 30, or where are we, do you think?
That's a really interesting question because, if you look at sort of the historiography on this particular battle, I mean, you got books like Gordon Prang's Miracle at Midway and Walter Lord's Incredible Victories. So sort of the common narrative, really, I hate to say it, up until the time Tony and I published our book on Midway back in 2005, was that, oh my God, we were facing overwhelming odds. And one of the things there it is.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you, bro. But one of the things that we tried to do in that book was, again, sort of push back on that narrative and say, yes, if you look at aggregate, how many ships the Japanese had at sea on June 4th, they handily outnumbered what the Americans had. But a lot of those ships are up in places like the Aleutians, or they're in, the main body that is 300 miles behind Nagumo, or they're, yada, yada, yada. Again, at the tip of the spear, you've got these two fairly evenly matched carrier forces, and that's who's going to decide the battle because, Yamamoto's main body might as well be on the moon for all the help that they can actually give to Nagumo if he gets into trouble, which, spoiler alert, he does.
Yeah. Because you look at the numbers, we had an airfield at Midway, we had carriers there, the planes were about equal. So I'll ask Trent his opinion. Trent, if you were an odds maker, what were the Americans' odds going into it, do you think?
I think, sort of returning to the plane market question, I think what we would see is things on a public trading space like that, probably very heavily favoring the Japanese. And then there would be this series of bets starting about June 2nd from those in the know, not unlike what we've seen, people trying to cash in on the intel that they had anonymously. Because if to John's point, if you know how this is shaping up, like, the Americans have 3 carriers there, they're inside the Japanese submarine cordon already, they're ready to strike. There's over 100 aircraft at Midway, there's a U.S. submarine cordon that the Japanese are likely to run into. Things are stacking up pretty well for the U.S. side. So I think it all depends on what intelligence you have access to.
And I think it'd be one of those things where, like, the odds would be more in favor as the battle went on, especially when Nagumo's changing his dilemma and all that.
Yeah. So stepping back, this is something that we mentioned in the notes. We haven't talked about explicitly here, that Nimitz was willing to offer battle even if he couldn't patch up the Yorktown, and even if the Japanese had brought Zuikaku. So he was willing to fight 2-on-5. And let me sort of explain why he was willing to do that. The doctrine of the time said that your average dive bomber would get a hit 1 time out of 6. I've got 2 squadrons of dive bombers of 18 planes on each one of my aircraft carriers, right? The doctrine also said that if I can get 3 hits against an enemy carrier, that should be sufficient to knock it out or sink it. So each one of those squadrons, by that math, should be capable of knocking out 1 enemy carrier. You got to get the drop on them. You got to attack first. But that means that theoretically, each one of my carriers, my American carriers, has got sufficient firepower, even in the dive bombers, to knock out 2 enemy carriers. And therefore, if even offering battle at 2 versus 4, that's not such a problem if our scouting is good, if we can attack effectively first. That's the nub of the whole matter. So by the time Yorktown is patched up and gets back up there, now Nimitz feels like, I've got sufficient firepower to deal with 6 enemy carriers, and I know that only 4 are coming to the party. So that's why he's willing to dial up that riskometer again and move his carrier forces closer to the Japanese. That's the underlying math here.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what Nimitz is thinking. And the willingness to fight, 2 potentially on 4 or 2 on 5, it does make a certain amount of sense from Nimitz's perspective, especially because he's counting on stuff from his submarines. He's counting on things from the air group at Midway. I mean, we tend to discount those as we talk about it now because they did not achieve the successes that were expected of them. But I don't think that means that counting on them before the battle was incorrect or, unsound. Nimitz has just a massive concentration of force ready, and it's like a trap. It's a trap. It's ready to be sprung. And the Japanese shows up, and the trap springs.
Okay, well, let's get into the battle now. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft bombed Midway Island, but the attack failed to destroy the airfields and the defenses completely. It seems like a sound strategy by the Japanese, but why didn't it work to their advantage? And shout out to the troops on Midway defending the island, especially the air base there, even though this is primarily a naval battle. But Trent, is this a good start to the battle?
Well, I mean, it makes a great deal of sense from the Japanese perspective, right? They know that Midway has an air base, Midway has seaplanes. If they're going to eventually assault it, they want to soften it up. They've applied this tactic at different locations before, like the ultimate capture of Wake Island earlier in the war. And so, yeah, that's the piece that they think can hurt them. They don't expect there to be U.S. naval forces nearby. So turning the attention of the carrier air groups against Midway to eliminate it essentially as a threat, makes a great deal of sense. So I'm not surprised that that's how it carries forward. I do think they are a bit surprised at how many planes are there, how extensive the defenses are. That forces them to think about, if we want to eliminate Midway as a player from the board, we're going to have to hit it again. And I do think that was unanticipated. And so their plan begins to start to unravel relatively quickly.
The problem comes for them that they've got a very flimsy scouting plan. They've only got 7 aircraft out, potentially looking for the American carriers, and they don't find us initially. So,
but why not send land troops in to take over Midway completely, or they couldn't land at that point?
You can't do it until the aircraft are knocked out. I mean, it's one thing to be showing up here with a carrier force that can maneuver at, 24, 28 knots, something like that. It's quite another to now be shoving an invasion force with 6 to 8 knot transports in it. Those things are sitting ducks until Midway's aircraft are eliminated. So that's what's got to happen, right off the bat.
Got it. Now we get into more of the naval battle. American aircraft launched from Midway and U.S. carriers make repeated attacks throughout the morning. So the scouting that we talked about earlier, how did the U.S. aviators find the Japanese fleet? It seems like it took a long time. How hard is it a task to find a fleet in the vast Pacific Ocean?
It's really, really difficult. We have this sort of mental image that you're up way, way high, and so you can see forever. But that doesn't actually work, because if you're up at a high altitude, any sort of cloud cover that's out there, the closer it gets to the horizon, it occludes more and more of your vision. And so actually the majority of the scouting was done at relatively low altitudes, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet, that kind of thing. Because in many cases, what you're doing is you're using the line of the horizon as you're looking for masts sticking up above the horizon. That's what you're actually looking for, which means that your line of vision is a lot lower than it would otherwise be, which means that you need a lot of airplanes up in the air to actually have a good chance of finding these forces. For the Americans, the initial sighting reports actually come from 2 different PBYs, these flying boats that have been flying out of Midway Atoll. And they're the ones that start sending back reports at about 0550 that, hey, found something out here. That in turn leads to the Americans launching a bunch of planes from Midway. And it's this real polyglot force. You got Army Air Force B-26 medium bombers that have got torpedoes strapped on them. And I mean, these dudes have never even seen a torpedo until they showed up like yesterday. And, Merry Christmas, you're now a torpedo plane pilot. We've got TBF Avenger torpedo planes. We've got, some dive bombers, but they don't move at the same speeds. They don't cruise. And so they all show up at different times, and the Japanese cap just annihilates them basically, and they do nothing.
Yeah. And then Trent, on the Japanese side, it seems like they didn't throw out as many scouting planes as they should have.
Because I think we have to remember, they're not anticipating that the U.S. ships are going to be there. There are lines of submarines between the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor and where they're operating. Those submarines don't all get where they need to be in time, but that's their plan. They think they have a distant screen in those submarines, and that's going to provide early warning. Then they're using, according to their doctrine, the Japanese are using cruiser scout planes to try to cover the areas where they think a threat could be. And Is it as extensive as it might have been? No, but I think it conforms to the patterns that exist at the time. They're following their doctrine and their procedures.
Yes and no.
Yeah, John's got a little he can add here.
Yeah, I mean, my co-author Tony wrote an article for the Naval War College Review a number of years ago that shows that Japanese doctrine, as far as their scouting is concerned, is all driven by their intel estimates. Then in those cases where they have an intel estimate that says there might be an enemy carrier here, lo and behold, you get much denser search patterns. But the intel that Nagumo had in his hand that morning was no, there's not going to be any American naval forces. And as such, they did a very cursory search, and it ends up biting them in the butt. You're trying to search an area the size of Sweden with 7 airplanes. And gee whiz, it turns out it's really tough to do that.
Yeah, but that was exactly my point. They're operating as they would expect to, given everything they know about the situation, right? And so, yeah, they don't spot the U.S. carriers as early as they might have. And this all cascades, right? Midway is stronger than anticipated. There's a whole series of strikes coming from Midway. Okay, we need to hit Midway again. So let's make sure that the aircraft aboard the carriers, the Japanese carriers, are armed to hit Midway again. And they, put that into train. And now, the clock is slowly ticking, and they don't realize that the clock on their destruction is ticking.
Yeah, and that goes back to my original point about intelligence. Like, I think they were so focused on surprising the Americans that they didn't even, I don't know if they comprehended that they were potentially walking into a trap.
No, they had no idea that there were American carriers there. None. Yeah. So, and that speaks to a central point, that carriers as a weapon system are very slow to react. And once you get behind the power curve in one of these battles, it's really difficult to, make up the lost ground. The lifeblood of all of these things is time. And now that you're behind the 8 ball again, you're running out of time more quickly than your enemy is. By the time that the Japanese finally do find the American carrier force at around 7:15, 7:30, thereabouts, and get a transmission back to Nagumo, all of the American planes that are ultimately going to destroy Nagumo are already in the process of being launched or are already up in the air. So the Americans can't be forestalled at this point anymore.
Can they pull back their bet, or do they still have to go all in at this point, or is it too late?
It's kind of too late, honestly. Because they're also, the Japanese, when I say they, are in the middle of trying to rearm their aircraft. So they hit Midway in the morning. The strike commander from Midway says, we need to hit Midway again. He sends a transmission back to Nagumo. Nagumo, having not seen any American carriers, is like, okay, let's go ahead and rearm our other half of our planes, our reserve strike. We're going to take the torpedoes off of them. We're going to put land attack bombs on. And they're in the middle of that process when the scouting report comes back from this one plane saying, hold the phone, there are Americans out here. Now you're completely wrong-footed. You've got to put, torpedoes back on some of your planes in Carrier Division 1. It's a hot mess. And so you're really behind the power curve at this point.
Well, let's finish up then with this. It goes back to Trent's book, The Art of Command. Nagumo has to make basically an uninformed decision. What's going through his mind?
I really wonder what's going through his mind at this point, because the way John was just describing it, if I were in Nagumo's shoes at that point, that's where I would just break out in a cold sweat, right? Because essentially what you've realized is, oh my goodness, the Americans have the drop on us.
Yeah.
And you're in the midst of rearming planes. You've just cited U.S. carriers. They know where you are because the strikes from Midway have been coming in. And so you're like, crap. But what I don't understand, what I don't know, obviously my view is influenced by everything that I know and the outcome of the battle. I wouldn't be surprised if Nagumo had more confidence at that point, just given what he knows about his carrier forces, their ability, how they've run roughshod over the Pacific. He may have been thinking, you know what? I've dealt with a whole series of these U.S. attacks from Midway. Their carrier planes are probably going to show up. We're probably going to shoot them down too. And then we're going to finish this thing.
Great point. We're playing armchair generals where we know the end of the story. They've run roughshod, right, John, for months. They're probably not worried.
Absolutely. And their combat air patrol is just manhandled all of the planes that come out from Midway. And the first carrier aircraft that show up, most famously, of course, Torpedo Squadron 8 at 09:17 in the morning. Those guys roll in, 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, and one dude left alive in the water. So from Japan's standpoint, they're looking at the proficiency of their combat air patrol pilots, and they're thinking, our guys are way better than the Americans. So the problem is when the American dive bombers show up, and that creates an entirely different sort of threat environment. It's one thing to shoot down slow, lumbering, almost sea level torpedo planes. It's quite another when, just fast forward here, at 10:10, the Americans, by hook or by crook, have managed to get two different formations of dive bombers, have both sighted the Japanese carrier force, Kido Butai, and they are coming in from two different directions, both from the southwest and from the northeast. And the package in the northeast also has some torpedo planes in it, and that's actually the element that the Japanese sight first. But what's been created here for the Japanese, who do not have radar, is they now have a multi-vector, multi-altitude threat to deal with. And since their cap arrangements are not being centrally coordinated, the whole thing falls apart. And that takes us to, the dramatic conclusion.
Right. And that's a great spot to pause on a cliffhanger there. So this is part one. We'll do part two in a week or so. But please check out Jon Parshall's books and Trent Hone's books, as well as follow. There you go. If you want to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals of World War II. And we thank both gentlemen for their time. We'll be back soon.